Welcome to topic 4201, Global Climate Politics and Governance. This presentation introduces the political and institutional foundations of international climate cooperation. Climate change is a global collective action problem because emissions are produced within national borders, but their effects are shared across the atmosphere, across generations, and across regions with different levels of vulnerability and responsibility. For that reason, climate change is not only an environmental issue. It is also a question of diplomacy, development, justice, finance, regulation, and implementation. Our focus is on how states, international organizations, regional initiatives, cities, and other actors coordinate responses under conditions of uncertainty and uneven capacity. We move from the UNFCCC framework to the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, then examine climate finance, carbon markets, national commitments, and multi-level action. The goal is to build a clear foundation for understanding how global climate governance works and why it matters for sustainable development and urban resilience. Here is the roadmap for the session. We begin by asking why climate governance matters and why climate change generates difficult coordination challenges. We then introduce several core concepts, including governance, regime complex, multi-level governance, and polycentric action. After that, we examine the architecture of the UNFCCC and the principles that underpin cooperation, such as equity and common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. With that framework in place, we compare the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement and explain the design shift from top-down negotiated targets toward nationally determined commitments, reporting, and periodic strengthening. We then broaden the lens to look at regime complexity, non-state actors, sectoral governance, and multi-level implementation. The final part of the lecture covers the European Green Deal, climate finance, carbon markets under Article 6, and two case illustrations, the Paris Agreement and the C40 City Network. We close with key takeaways linking climate governance to sustainability and resilience. The learning objectives for topic 4201 are straightforward but important. First, you should be able to define the basic concepts and frameworks of global climate governance and international cooperation on climate change. Second, you should be able to describe the main goals and principles of major climate agreements, especially the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. Third, you should be able to explain how global and regional initiatives, including UNFCCC mechanisms and the European Green Deal, can support sustainable development and urban resilience. Fourth, you should be able to identify the roles of climate finance, carbon markets, and national commitments such as NDCs and adaptation-related measures in achieving climate goals. Finally, this topic aims to develop awareness of shared environmental responsibility. Climate governance is not only about formal rules, it is also about collaboration, trust, accountability, and support for a sustainable and climate-resilient future. Keep these 5 outcomes in mind because each section connects back to at least one of them. Why do we need global climate governance at all? The simple answer is that climate change combines shared risk with fragmented authority. The atmosphere is shared, but political power is distributed across sovereign states, regional institutions, local governments, firms, and civil society actors. Emissions released in one place affect climate conditions elsewhere, so purely national solutions are inadequate. At the same time, climate policy involves long time horizons, uncertainty, and difficult questions about who should act first, who should pay, and how burdens and opportunities should be distributed. These distributional tensions are one reason negotiations are often slow and contested. Governance provides a way to organize collective responses through rules, norms, procedures, reporting systems, finance, and cooperation mechanisms. It can set direction, reduce uncertainty, create expectations, and improve accountability. It can also support countries and communities that face capacity constraints through finance, technology transfer, and knowledge sharing. Governance does not solve the climate problem automatically, but it provides the architecture through which mitigation, adaptation, and resilience building can become more coordinated and politically durable. Before looking at treaties and institutions, we need a quick glossary of key terms. Governance refers to the broader set of rules, institutions, practices, and coordination processes through which collective action is organized. It is wider than government because it includes public and private actors. A regime is a more specific set of norms, rules, and decision procedures in a policy area, such as international climate cooperation. A regime complex exists when multiple institutions address the same problem in partially overlapping ways instead of under one fully unified system. Multi-level governance highlights interactions across global, regional, national, and local levels. Polycentric action refers to the existence of multiple centers of decision-making rather than one central authority. These concepts matter because climate change is governed through layered institutions, not through a single world government. The field includes treaty bodies, national laws, city networks, development banks, sectoral organizations, and private standards. Understanding these terms helps us interpret both the strengths and the limits of the current governance landscape. The UNFCCC provides the core architecture of international climate governance. Adopted in 1992, it established the broad objective of preventing dangerous human interference with the climate system and created a durable forum for negotiation, review, and institutional development. Within this framework, the Conference of the Parties, or COP, serves as the main decision-making body. Subsidiary bodies support scientific, technical, and implementation work, while the Secretariat helps organize the process and maintain continuity. National governments remain central actors, but observers such as cities, business groups, and NGOs also participate in important ways. Finance and technology mechanisms were added to support action, especially in countries with fewer resources. The Convention is also grounded in principles that shape climate debates, including equity, national circumstances, and common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. COP decisions can therefore extend and operationalize the Convention over time. The UNFCCC is best understood as an umbrella framework that has allowed climate governance to evolve through protocols, agreements, review systems, and implementation mechanisms. The Kyoto Protocol, adopted in 1997 and entering into force in 2005, was the first major attempt to translate the UNFCCC framework into quantified legal commitments. Its design reflected a top-down model. Binding emissions targets were assigned mainly to Annex I parties, meaning industrialized countries and economies in transition. The protocol also introduced commitment periods and a compliance-oriented structure. One of its most important innovations was the creation of market-based flexibility mechanisms, emissions trading, joint implementation, and the clean development mechanism. These instruments were intended to lower the cost of mitigation by allowing reductions to occur where they were cheaper or by generating credits through projects. Kyoto was historically significant because it moved climate cooperation beyond general principles to measurable obligations. At the same time, it faced limits related to participation, political acceptability, and uneven coverage of global emissions. Those constraints strongly influenced later reforms in climate governance. A useful way to understand the evolution of climate politics is to compare the logic of Kyoto with the logic of Paris. Under Kyoto, the system relied on negotiated top-down targets for a limited group of industrialized countries. This model had legal clarity, but it struggled to secure broad and durable participation from all major emitters. The Paris Agreement, adopted in 2015, retained the multilateral framework but shifted the architecture. Instead of centrally negotiated targets for only some states, countries now submit nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, that reflect domestic politics and capabilities while remaining part of a shared international process. This shift matters because ambitious climate action has to be rooted in domestic feasibility as well as international coordination. Paris therefore moved from a narrower compliance model toward a broader participation and ambition model. International expectations still matter, but they work through review and iterative pressure rather than fixed top-down targets for only part of the world. The Paris Agreement centers on a set of mutually reinforcing elements. First, it establishes long-term temperature goals, including holding warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels and pursuing efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees. Second, it requires parties to prepare, communicate, and maintain NDCs, which are the core national pledges for mitigation and related action. Third, It gives adaptation a more visible place within the international framework and recognizes the need for support. Fourth, it creates an enhanced transparency framework to improve reporting, comparability, and trust. Fifth, it includes a global stocktake that periodically assesses collective progress and is intended to inform stronger future action. Finally, Article 6 provides for international cooperation through market and non-market approaches. In practice, the agreement relies on repeated cycles of submission, implementation, reporting, review, and updating rather than one single enforcement tool. Climate governance today is often described as a regime complex rather than a single coherent regime. The UNFCCC remains the core multilateral forum, but it operates alongside many other institutions and processes that influence climate outcomes. Examples include the G7 and G20, sector-specific bodies such as the International Civil Aviation Organization and the International Maritime Organization, regional emissions trading systems, carbon taxes, climate clubs, development finance institutions, and transnational city and business networks. This complexity has both advantages and disadvantages. Overlapping venues can create flexibility, experimentation, and opportunities for progress when one arena stalls. But fragmentation can also weaken coherence, create inconsistent rules, and make accountability harder. No single venue can govern every sector, finance flow, and implementation challenge at once. The key lesson is that climate governance is a wider institutional ecosystem with different strengths, incentives, and legitimacy challenges. Because climate governance extends beyond states, non-state and transnational actors have become increasingly important. Cities and regions participate through networks, voluntary initiatives, and local implementation practices. Businesses shape outcomes through investment decisions, supply chains, disclosure systems, and corporate climate strategies. Civil society organizations and academic institutions contribute advocacy, monitoring, expertise, and public accountability. Some scholars describe the role of international institutions in this broader landscape as orchestration, meaning that formal bodies do not always command action directly but can steer, coordinate, and encourage it through guidance, recognition, information, and partnership structures. The rise of non-state action has expanded the range of climate initiatives, but it has also created concerns about uneven quality, weak enforcement, and credibility gaps. A city or company can announce an ambitious target, for example, but implementation may remain uncertain. Transnational action is therefore best understood as a complement to public governance, not a substitute for it. Cities are especially relevant because many climate challenges and solutions are concentrated in urban systems. Buildings, transport, waste, energy demand, and adaptation needs all have strong urban dimensions. The C40 network is a useful illustration of how cities can complement national and international efforts. Through peer learning, benchmarking, and exchange of policy experience, city networks can spread practical approaches more quickly than traditional diplomatic channels. They also help local governments frame climate action in terms of co-benefits such as air quality, mobility, public health, energy efficiency, and resilience. At the same time, participation is uneven. Some cities have stronger administrative capacity, finance, and political support than others. That means city networks should not be romanticized as automatic solutions. Their impact depends on implementation, local context, and links with national and regional policy. This is why urban governance matters so much for resilience-oriented teaching and practice. Another way to analyze climate governance is through a sectoral lens. Not all parts of the economy face the same barriers, technologies, infrastructures, or actor constellations. Power systems, transport, shipping, aviation, buildings, industry, land use, and food systems each have distinct decarbonization challenges. A sectoral perspective therefore asks whether global governance arrangements actually address the specific needs and bottlenecks of particular socio-technical systems. This is useful because some sectors depend on long-lived infrastructure, some are governed by specialized international bodies, and some require different mixes of finance, standards, innovation support, and transparency. In other words, climate governance becomes more precise when we ask not only who governs, but what is being governed and through which functions. Broad climate treaties are essential, yet effective governance often requires more targeted arrangements that fit the institutional and technological characteristics of specific sectors. Multi-level climate governance captures how action is distributed across scales. At the global level, the UNFCCC and Paris Agreement provide shared goals, rules, and reporting structures. At the regional level, bodies such as the European Union develop policy packages that can shape investment, regulation, and collective ambition. At the national level, governments translate international commitments into laws, planning systems, and policy instruments. At the local level, cities and projects turn those frameworks into implementation choices that affect infrastructure, land use, mobility, buildings, and adaptation. The relationship across these levels is not simply hierarchical. It also involves feedback, diffusion, and learning. Local innovation can travel upward, while global frameworks can shape domestic priorities and expectations. Alignment across levels can reduce policy friction and improve implementation quality. One practical implication is that implementation often depends on local and sectoral capacities even when goals are negotiated internationally. Another is that misalignment across levels can create friction. The European Green Deal is an example of how regional initiatives can contribute to climate governance while linking mitigation to broader economic and social transformation. Rather than functioning as a single climate treaty, it operates as a strategic policy framework that combines climate objectives with industrial policy, innovation, environmental protection, investment planning, and the idea of a just transition. This is relevant to topic 4201 because it shows how regional governance can raise ambition, shape market expectations, and influence global norms beyond the UNFCCC process. It also connects climate policy with resilience-related concerns, including adaptation, risk management, and the future of urban and territorial systems. Importantly, the Green Deal illustrates that climate governance is not only about setting emissions targets. It is also about building policy mixes that support transition pathways and create direction for investment. At the same time, its real-world effects still depend on implementation, political continuity, and interaction with national and local policies. Climate finance is often described as an enabling condition for climate action. Many mitigation and adaptation measures require upfront investment, institutional capacity, and long-term planning. Finance can come from public sources, private sources, or blended arrangements that combine different forms of support and risk sharing. Within the international climate regime, finance is also tied to questions of equity and responsibility, because countries differ greatly in historical emissions, fiscal capacity, exposure to impacts, and development needs. For that reason, climate finance is not just a technical funding issue, it is also a political and ethical issue. Under the UNFCCC architecture, financial mechanisms and institutions such as the Green Climate Fund are intended to support action, especially where domestic resources are limited. Finance can also support planning, data systems, institutional learning, and adaptation capacity. However, the quality of finance matters as much as the quantity. Access, transparency, effectiveness, predictability, and fairness all shape whether finance actually supports resilient and sustainable outcomes. Carbon markets and Article 6 of the Paris Agreement illustrate both the potential and the complexity of market-based cooperation. More broadly, carbon pricing tools include carbon taxes, emissions trading systems, and crediting mechanisms. These approaches aim to create economic signals that favor lower carbon choices. Under Article 6, countries may cooperate through different channels. Article 6.2 concerns bilateral or multilateral cooperation involving internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. Article 6.4 establishes a UN-governed crediting mechanism. Article 6.8 recognizes non-market approaches. In principle, these instruments can lower costs and increase flexibility, but they also raise governance concerns. One major issue is environmental integrity. Reductions should be real, measurable, and not counted twice. Another concern is distribution: who benefits, who bears risk, and whether market participation supports or distracts from domestic transformation. Carbon markets can be useful tools, but only with strong accounting, oversight, and institutional trust. Our two case illustrations bring the broader governance discussion into focus. The first case is the Paris Agreement itself. Its significance lies not only in its legal text but in its political logic: broad participation, nationally determined pledges, transparency, and repeated ambition cycles. It was designed to break with the limitations of a narrower top-down model and to create a framework that more countries could join and sustain. The second case is C40, which illustrates transnational climate action among cities. Here the emphasis is on policy learning, implementation, and the exchange of practical strategies rather than treaty negotiation. Together, these cases show two complementary dimensions of climate governance. Paris demonstrates how international cooperation can organize a universal framework under conditions of sovereignty and diversity. C40 shows how subnational actors can translate climate goals into urban practice and create momentum through peer networks. Both cases also show that governance is an ongoing process rather than a one-time institutional design choice. To conclude, global climate governance is best understood as a layered system for coordinating action under shared risk. The UNFCCC provides the umbrella framework, while the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement mark two distinct phases in the evolution of international cooperation. Kyoto demonstrated the value and limits of binding top-down commitments for a narrower set of countries. Paris broadened participation by building a system around NDCs, transparency, stocktakes, and iterative strengthening. Beyond the treaty core, governance is increasingly multi-level and multi-actor, involving regional initiatives, city networks, sectoral institutions, finance providers, and market mechanisms. This complexity creates opportunities for innovation and learning, but it also creates risks of fragmentation, uneven implementation, and weak accountability. For sustainable development and urban resilience, the lesson is clear. Climate governance matters not only because it organizes emissions reduction, but because it shapes how societies coordinate adaptation, mobilize support, and share responsibility for a more climate-resilient future. That broader sense of shared responsibility is one of the most important themes of the topic.